to the website, Jill2016.com. It's on the very front page. And Brandon, we're not going to end in Philly because we're also going to do the same thing in Milwaukee, Wisconsin in March. And we're going to do the same thing in Detroit, Michigan in April. That's right. The 3 states where Jill Stein attempted a recount, we're going to build on that momentum and build voting justice conferences in order to build a movement to transform elections in this country.
Well, obviously, I started a little bit tongue-in-cheek by mentioning election integrity as it relates to the Russia hacking thing, because I think that when we think about election integrity, at least in the mainstream media right now, that's what the conversations revolving around. These vague conversations that have been started by the CIA and the intelligence community and have been repeated by the mainstream media to give. So, and I'm torn, but I would, to be blunt, to give a veil of whatever you would call it to the Democratic Party for absolve them of their wrongdoing. Let's put it that way. Like this Russia narrative, whether or not it's true, has seemed to be just being used in service of the Democratic Party not changing. But your conference is interested in a variety of different ways in which the voting integrity in America is doesn't have any integrity. Yes, you put it so blankly, for a variety of reasons. And I'm looking through these conferences that you have planned, and I noticed that you basically run the gamut. They run from the actual structure of the voting process, insofar you're talking about voting machines, et cetera, to things like to ways in which people are disenfranchised and that are not normally talked about. So redistricting, barriers to ballot access. So I'm going to stop you for a moment
because this is really important. Redistricting and gerrymandering. The United States of America is the only democracy in the world, and I'm serious about this, the only democracy in the world that lets the elected official pick their voter by drawing their own lines, right? Instead of the voters picking and choosing our elected representatives, the elected representatives are choosing their own voters, and then we vote. This is outrageous. And it's one of the reasons why in many cases you saw in certain states, Democrats win 65% of the vote and yet only get 40% of the elected representatives because of the gerrymandering process. So I appreciate you bringing it up, and I really wanted to go deep on that one because that is a problem.
Oh, no, I mean, obviously there are so many ways in which people are actively being disenfranchised and passively being disenfranchised in America. So ways in which people's votes are being taken or devalued. And so I think that the two main ones that we talked about have been redistricting and also the Electoral College in ways in which that skews people's votes to be almost meaningless in certain states, certain districts. I live in New York City. So, I mean, I live in New York City. I live in which is in New York State, obviously. So my vote is essentially meaningless. It has meaning up until the point in which the state decides who it's going to go for, and
right. I mean,
it's realistic. It's going blue. Like it's always going to go blue. So I am free to vote for whoever I want, or not vote at all, because my vote is essentially, if it's not disenfranchisement, from the legal standpoint.
You are not empowered as a voter. You are not empowered as a voter because of how the Electoral College works. And, so that's part of, we'll be talking about the National Popular Vote, which is an effort to abolish the Electoral College. We'll be talking about the electoral Jim Crow that is basically being reconstituted through the use of interstate cross-check. So again, we're going to be talking about a lot of things that are normally not talked about, which we think are profoundly important if we're actually going to make the United States government a democratic government. Because right now, it's not. Democracy means the people rule. Demos cratia, the people rule and the people govern. We're not governing ourselves, Brandon. The reality is there is a small ruling elite who literally control this country. And they also control both of the established parties. Because I'm going to go deep here and tell you this. I think principled liberals or progressives have been lied to and sold out by the ruling elite of the Democratic Party who were taking their money and their marching orders from Wall Street America, big banks, and corporations. But Brandon, I'm going to go deeper still and tell you, I think principled conservatives have been lied to and sold out by the ruling elite of the Republican Party, who were taking their money from the same damn corporations, Wall Street executives, and big banks. At the end of the day, ordinary people are literally being ruled and governed by a shadow government that is never up for election, but are completely controlling how our society is organized. And that, again, is why I'm a nonviolent revolutionary.
I have a question. Do you find it hard to get people? So obviously, I think that you have a great plan, a multifaceted plan. You're attacking this problem at all from every angle, both the disenchantment that the system instills in people and also the system itself, insofar that it's being made up of disenfranchising laws, et cetera, et cetera. But do you find it hard, or rather in your attempts to popularize this issue, do you find it hard to make people care about the process of voting? The November 8th vote is cast, and now are thinking about voting, considering, like you said, the way we do democracy, I would say skew towards the national, right? That's what's on everyone's mind. That's what people think defines the way the country is going to go. People get hyper focused, they get worn out, and then as soon as it's over, treats democracy as a crisis. Like it by the voting process on November 8th, 4 years crisis, creates this big crisis, and to have it over, that they tend to not think about it after it's done. So, all right, rather, that's an assumption on my part, but do you find who are not already mired in this issue to engage with the voting process, to engage with what their vote means once November has passed? Now we're in February. How hard is it to really say in 4 years?
So, Brandon, thank you, because I did get the drift of your question. And the short answer is yes. I do find it challenging and difficult, because so many people say, look, voting doesn't matter. We try to vote and the system is so rigged. And frankly, they have a very good point. But what I say is this: if you want systemic change and all you ever do is go vote or pull a lever every 2 to 4 years, and that's the sum total of your efforts at significant or social change, you're wasting your time, right? But I'll also tell you this, Brandon. I tell the same folks, if you want systemic change and you don't vote for candidates who are calling for systemic change, like Jill Stein, like David Cobb, like Ajamu Baraka, then you're wasting an opportunity. And so I try to encourage people to think about voting as a way, but not the only way. In addition to that, I really encourage people, and like I do myself, to get involved in local elections, because local elections don't get the same level of attention by the national corporate media, but there's a lot more power that we have at the local level. We can actually win races. Here's something interesting that I bet you didn't know. There have been over 10,000 Greens elected over the last 20 years. Right now, there are 300 elected Greens serving at the local level. Right now, I can tell you, in the last 4 election cycles, Greens ran and won 30%, almost a third, just underneath a third, but over 30% of the local nonpartisan races that we ran in. So one of the things that I try to do is encourage people to think about getting involved at the local level. And that local level actually has a lot of influence on our lives, even though people are not, people don't get the corporate media gloss that they do in other ways. So yes, I find it challenging. The way I try to meet that challenge is to acknowledge that their cynicism is well placed, but also I remind people, the ruling elite fought like hell to prevent women from voting, to prevent Black folks from voting, They instilled poll taxes to try to keep poor people from voting. There's a reason that the ruling elite fights so hard to prevent people from voting, because it is a way to exercise power. It's not the only way, but it is a very important way.
Well, it sounds like you're talking about just a comprehensive change in the way people view democracy, voting, and view their place in that system. And I would say that there just seems to be a gap between the voter and the politician in so many different ways that we're just trying, but just by insofar that people need to be focused at the local elections, I think that's absolutely true. I think we've seen in the past, on November 8th, we've seen that now 33 states have entirely Republican in governorships. So that's 33 states where Democrats are not in any kind of control. Progressives, have lost control of the state. Democrats lose thousands of seats across America and still pretend as though they're the only viable avenue for progressives to enter the government. So, about the Democratic Party, like I said, Anoa is at the DNC debate. What is your opinion on the takeover of the DNC that seems to be in its nascency?
So listen, I'm glad you asked the question, and I want to be very clear here. Remember when I said I don't know what I don't know? I don't pretend that I have the answer. What I have is an opinion on the question that you just asked. I personally do not believe that it is possible to, quote, take over the Democratic Party. I believe that corporate money, Wall Street America, is like a cancer that is mastitised within the body politic. And I think that the corporatists and militarists and imperialists who actually run that country are not going to give up economic power. They will cater with some issues around race. They'll cater with some superficial issues or superficial ways around gender or sexual orientation. But they're not going to actually give up control of the party apparatus. The corporatists would rather kill the Democratic Party than allow genuine progressives to take over the Democratic Party. And I say that again from history. Look, I worked on Jesse Jackson's campaign. And after he had the experience he and we had in 84 and 88, let's create an alternative organization to take over the Democratic Party and shift it to the left. That was called Rainbow Push. It basically failed. Then 4 years later, Jerry Brown, a progressive uprising within the Democratic Party primary, squashed by the corporatist militarists who control that party. He said, I know what let's do. Let's create another organization, take over the Democratic Party, shift it to the left. That was called We the People. 4 years later, Dennis Kucinich rises up, a progressive upwelling within the Democratic Party primary, squashed by the corporatist militarists who control the party. He said, I know what let's do. Let's form another organization, take over the Democratic Party, shift it to the left. That was called Democracy, or Progressive Democrats of America. 4 years later, Howard Dean rose up, squashed by the corporatists. He formed Democracy for America. Look, at the end of the day, Brandon, it doesn't work. That's my lived experience, that this idea of trying to take over the apparatus of the Democratic Party is a failed strategy. And that's the reason that, with all due respect, and I mean great respect to Bernie Sanders, he's just wrong about the idea of taking over the Democratic Party. And you know what, Brandon? Everybody is allowed to be wrong sometimes. Nobody is infallible. And this is an example where I believe Bernie is wrong. And I think but what's really worth pointing out, our revolution, Bernie's effort, and Justice Democrats, and Brand New Congress, and Indivisible, and We Will Replace You.org, and Progressive or Bust, and Draft Bernie for a New Party. That's 8 different constellations or efforts that I'm personally tracking that is showing that the Democratic Party is losing control of their own constituency. People who self-identify as Democrats are absolutely disgusted. And the DNC fight that's going on right now, the corporate media is working very hard to try to pretend like it's only between Perez or Ellison. But I'm glad you brought up Sam Ronan. I'm glad to learn and not surprised that Anoa interviewed him. I'm going to now go and look for it to read it, because Sam Ronan is the only one of those candidates for the DNC who is willing to say, we've got to change the way the Democratic National Committee conducts the Democratic Party primary, because the DNC cheated Bernie Sanders. And that corruption has got to end. Keith Ellison is not willing to say it. Tom Perez is not willing to say it. No other candidate is willing to say it. So at the end of the day, it's very hard for me to understand how it is possible to actually, quote, take over the DNC whenever the DNC is controlled by the apparatchiks.
Well, we talked about this before we came on, so I feel like I'm repeating myself, but I think that the same thing that makes taking over the DNC so appealing and so attractive to people, like to anyone really, is the exact same thing that makes it so hard to actually take over. And that is the apparatus. That is all the money. That is this infrastructure that people want to take over. But that infrastructure, even I would say divorced from people, has its own demands. And we've seen that. I think the DNC race has been very enlightening, because we are seeing again, or rather the DNC race, as we know, is the people who are allowed to vote in it are all Democratic establishment in some way, shape, or form. And so what we're seeing people have to do their best. Ellison, Tom Perez, everyone, I would say, except Sam Ronan, to speak, to garner votes from the establishment Dems, but also try to pay lip service to all the grievances that many progressives had, and keep as many progressives in the Democratic Party as possible. We know Dem exit has been a thing for a while now, et cetera. People are looking for coalition-style government. People are just fed up with the Democratic Party. And I mean, from my perspective, this race is not particularly interesting to me. And I'm not because I'm cynical, but because I don't think there's an answer within the two-party system. Well, so from my perspective,
and I don't think that the answer is within the two-party system. And I think that you're absolutely correct that look, we're already watching Keith Ellison begin to moderate his language, his positions, and it is not funny. It is heartbreaking to watch him contort himself to try to appease the Democratic Party insiders and keep his progressive principles intact. Because you're correct, Brandon, that Keith Ellison's task and Bernie Sanders' task is to keep people in the Democratic Party. Do you know that Gallup poll data shows that 14 million people have left the Democratic Party since the primary? And that's with Bernie working his butt off to try to keep them in. This is one of the largest mass defections from a major political party that we've seen in the modern era, Brandon, and nobody's talking about it.
Well, just to correct you, I think I take the position that, I didn't leave Democrats. Democrats left me. Democrats left me 25 years ago, with Clinton. That's when the Democrats left me, maybe before then. So insofar that people are quote unquote leaving the Democratic Party, I think that's a I don't know. Like that, I think that frame is problematic. Obviously, it's not your frame, but I think the real story here is that people are finally woken up to the fact that the Democratic Party is duplicitous. It says one thing. It says one thing, and this is where I tend to agree with you about Bernie Sanders and Keith Ellison, insofar that I think their intentions are good. I think they feel like, I think they've been in politics for a very long time, and they feel the constraints of that. They feel like the Democratic Party is the only way to go, or rather the best way to go, and they're trying to contort themselves to make themselves fit just enough to get to positions of leadership to actually, or rather what they should be doing is making the Democrats come to them. They should be making the Democrats come to them. And, as far as Bernie Sanders goes, I have to say, I think he's doing a disservice in speaking out for them, because it just gives them another progressive face to hide their conservative ideology. Like we've seen him go out there and push these pharma bills to be able to import drugs from Canada, and for Democrats to stab him in the back. And it becomes, at a certain point, when is helping the Dems hurting America? No, like when, like at what point do we say the Democratic Party is devoid of merit? Simpler to build something new, a coalition, whatever you want to call it. It's just simpler and it's less. We're gonna have to fight them anyway, so why not fight them from outside?
I appreciate you sort of changing the frame a little bit. Because I started off as a Democrat myself, right, working on Jesse Jackson's campaign, then Jerry Brown. I'll be very candid. Bill Clinton turned me into a Green, right? And if Hillary Clinton had gotten elected, she would have made millions more Greens, right? And I think it's worth pointing out that Bill Clinton literally was one of the founders of a group called the Democratic Leadership Council, which was basically Wall Street financiers, corporate interest. They are the architects of neoliberalism, the idea of privatizing public sector decision making. The DLC, the Democratic Leadership Council, doesn't exist anymore. You know why? Because they don't have to. They literally took over and run now the entire DNC. And if you do your history and do your research, you'll find most of the founders of the DLC went on to become, and some of them still are, in leadership positions within the Democratic National Committee. So here's my sort of take on this. As hard as it is to create an independent political party, and it is hard, I think it's more likely to succeed than it is to try to, quote, take over the Democratic Party. Because I think your point about the allure, because it's got so much infrastructure, it's got all these things, but it's got all those things precisely because of corporate America wanting to give them all these things. I think you're right. We're going to have this fight anyway about what the heart and soul of America is. I think we'd be better off actually building a progressive infrastructure that is independently funded, like Bernie's campaign in the primary was. One of the things that we can never, ever forget is that Bernie Sanders outraised Hillary Clinton, and he did it at, what was it, 26, 28 bucks average per pop?
27,
right in between. But at 27 bucks a pop, Brandon, we can actually do this. We can build an independent force. We can fundraise for it if we all pitch in a little bit. And that's something that I'm really interested in doing. And then the last thing that I'll say on this, because I do want to have the same humility. Remember my experience at the anti-apartheid activists in the 80s.
No, it's not tricking if you got it. If it's not bragging if you got it, just go ahead.
Well, I will tell you this. I might be wrong, right? If I'm wrong and somehow the Democratic Party becomes a genuine progressive force, then I'll say I was wrong and let's get to work and work together. But at the end of the day, we've got to make the commitment that says there is a bottom line definition here. You've got to actually be for single payer universal health care as a fundamental human right. You've got to actually be for raising the minimum wage to a true living wage. You've got to be for transitioning away from coal and oil and nuclear power to clean, sustainable alternative energy sources. We've got to be for dismantling the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, and the World Trade Organization. We've got to actually be for a new guarantee that education will be free, not only through high school, but college as well. See, there's some base level that we ought to say, you've got to be for that, or you can't claim to be a progressive. And I don't think that the corporatists who control the Democratic Party in any way, shape, or form are going to beat those definitions. But if we self-describe what it will take to earn our vote, then we will have power.
See, I think that you're exactly right there. And so I think that whether you want to work within the Democratic Party or work outside of it to build a new party or new coalition or whatever you want to call it, the goal is really the same: to move American politics to the left, to start getting in the conversation these issues that have been, at least in this last electoral cycle, just wholesale been deemed. We saw people call universal health care impossible, single payer health care impossible, free college tuition impossible. It's funny that's impossible because other countries have it, but that's, I don't know. I don't know. Whatever.
Look,
but
I think this is really important, though. Like, so they said that those things were impossible. Not only do other countries have it, but I'm going to talk about this country for a moment. Remember that to be an abolitionist in the 1830s, to call to end the enslavement of Africans, was impossible. For women to claim the right to vote before or during Seneca Falls Convention was impossible. For trade unionists to be able to argue that they should have the legal right to collectively bargain was impossible. To end Jim Crow segregation was impossible. For goodness sakes, Brandon, everything that is decent and good in this country was once impossible. You know, and for that matter, the creation of this country itself, the idea that we could reject the empire, the British Empire, and create a new government was impossible. And Nelson Mandela said it best: everything is impossible until it's not.
I agree, but I would go a step further and say we need to start calling it out for what it is. It's not that things are impossible to do. It's that they're untenable for those who are in power to actually do them. And insofar that their corporate donors do not want them done. And so that's where I agree with your second point that you made a while back, that one of the goals, at least, or rather one of the goals should be to wrest control of what it means to be on the left from Democrats. Because Democrats, by nature of being the left party, have gotten to dictate what is possible, or what the conversation on the left should be. They've been able to say, well, hey, here's what we should talk about. And like, here is the left, for lack of a better word. Here are our preoccupations. Here's what we want to see done. Here's what we're about. And as we've seen, the Democratic Party at its highest levels are incredibly conservative. They are incredibly conservative economically, and also pretty conservative socially. I don't know, people think they're not that socially progressive. They're still incredibly conservative. I mean, socially, insofar that even Barack Obama had to evolve on gay marriage. Hillary Clinton was in favor of wasn't in favor of gay marriage until just these sort of, like, this notion that they're so evolved socially in comparison to who, obviously Republicans, but not in comparison to their base. And so
not in comparison to overall culture. Remember that it was not the Democratic Party leadership. It wasn't even Democratic Party operatives, the most progressive Democratic Party operatives. It was social change agents working out in their communities that shifted the conversation around same-sex rights and same-sex marriage. It was ordinary people who actually were able to put their bodies on the line to end Jim Crow segregation. It was ordinary people who are able to actually be building the fight for the rights of transgendered persons to be recognized as human beings with human rights. So I really think that you're making a very critical, important point here, Brandon, about not allowing the Democratic Party at all to be the arbiter of what it is to be progressive or left, or for that matter, to be acceptable. I mean, I want to actually engage ordinary people with the concept that goes like this. I think that if there is a decision that affects your life, you ought to have an opportunity to weigh in on it. Not that you get to be the decider, because there should be a collective process, but all of us should have a way to meaningfully participate in any decision that affects our lives. That could be called economic democracy, could be called socialism, but I'll tell you what it can't be called. It can't be called capitalism, because capitalism is an economic system that literally allows for the private ownership and control of the mechanisms for decision making. So to me, I can go into any pool hall or bowling alley or barber shop or beauty salon in this country and have a real revolutionary conversation without ever using any kind of lefty rhetoric or jargon. Because the ordinary American, regardless of race or gender or geography, knows that the system is not working, that a small ruling elite are in control and they don't like it.
I mean, not only that, but under capitalism, everything becomes commodified, including our government. So Brandon,
I will give you credit now? Because I'm totally stealing that. That is a good one.
No, that's not even a joke. I mean, it's just the reality. Now we become commodified. Our labor becomes commodified. Our lives become commodified. Maybe not at the beginning, but towards the end of capitalism, once you get into late capitalism, like where profits tend to fall, everything becomes commodified. And as we've seen, our government, our politicians, they were commodified. People bought them because why wouldn't you? It's what it is in that front.
It's not.
I think we're going back.
There's nothing personal.
But I guess I'm a little bit more radical than you, or maybe a point of view. I think because we need to get money out of politics. I'm like, absolutely, we definitely do. We definitely have to get money out of politics. But you know what else needs to go? The people, it's not simply enough to get repeal Citizens United and go, okay, Booker can still be there. They can still, because now the money is going. It's like, no, I think the money, or rather, money, you have to take money to ball at all. This notion that money that we've seen repeated, regurgitated on both the left and the right is indicative of low morals. I'm not impressed by someone. I'm not impressed by someone who would take money. And so just the nature that someone would take, $300,000 from Big Pharma and then vote against a drug bill that would benefit Americans tells me that the money is part of the problem, but there's something inherent to them that makes them think that's acceptable. And if it's not money, it'll be something else. There will always be a way to buy people with low morals, but but for money, it would be power, influence, a job after. So but getting the money out of politics will definitely make people with better morals more competitive within races. And so that's what I would like to see. I don't think that getting rid of money in politics is the fix all for this issue, because I think the politicians that we have in our government are inherently corruptible. There's something internal to them.
If in any way I gave the indication that I thought if we just got money out of elections that we would solve all the problems.
Oh no, I was just saying. I've not been
effectively communicating. For example, one of the things that I support as it relates to Citizens United, can't just overturn one Supreme Court decision. When it relates to Citizens United, I support a 28th Amendment to the United States Constitution that would abolish in its entirety the concept that money is free speech, and to abolish in its entirety the idea that a corporation is a person with constitutional rights. Because this idea of corporate personhood allows the wealthy elite to overturn environmental protection laws, worker safety laws, public health laws. They literally have our democracy from us, and then they use the legal system to legalize the theft. So I agree we got to get money out of elections, and we've got to go a lot further. So that's part of the reason, again, why our democratizing elections / voting justice conferences go way beyond. It includes 100% publicly funded elections, but we go way beyond those. And if you look at the Green Party's platform, I think it really is a common sense, revolutionary call to restructure how our society operates. And I'm glad that you actually brought morality into the conversation. I actually think that morals and ethics matter, and we ought to talk about it as if it matters.
No, I agree. I think that capitalism, and it's not just me, is an inherently amoral system. It's not immoral, it's just amoral. It doesn't have, or rather, the morality that it espouses is one of the most profit is, money equals morality, for lack of a better term. I definitely think that when I hear stuff like this is a common sense solution, I start to roll my eyes and go, okay, no, it's not. You're just talking about deregulation. you're just a Republican talking about deregulation. It's like, of course it's common sense. It's like, no, but I agree that it's not necessarily that the Green Party's platform is that radical from an objective standpoint, but subjectively within American politics, it seems incredibly radical. It seems like the notion of quantitative easement for student loan debt blew people's minds, and it was like, well, why? It's really not that complicated or radical. And if you look at at the global level, it just seems so radical because the domination, not even the domination of the political spectrum, or rather what constitutes political spectrum at the highest levels by Democrat, Republican, but just the domination of the left by Democrats and their neoliberal agenda. And that's why, at least from my perspective, people want to go back and forth with Hillary or Trump, and they did a long time ago. And for me, that choice was meaningless, not because Hillary was worse than Trump, because Hillary was, I think even in hindsight and foresight, Hillary was better than Trump. But within this two-party dichotomy, this dynamic, we were always headed towards a Trump-like scenario in my head, like a Trump-like scenario. If it wasn't Trump, it would have been Cruz. If it wasn't Cruz, it would have been Pence. If it wasn't Pence, we would have gotten there eventually. And so we have to, it behooves us on the left to understand what the resistance, what resisting really means, and how it encompasses the Democratic establishment, how we have to also resist them and demand that they basically respect their base in a way that they haven't done in a long time. The Democratic Party does not. Oh yeah, so sorry people, we are going to have to close up in about 3 or 4 minutes, so let's just get a little, last thoughts, anything in particular.
Well, Brandon, thank you so much for this incredible conversation. I also want to thank David Grossman, the voice that you never heard, but Brandon and I did, that actually made all of this possible. I also want to thank the Benjamin Dixon Network and the Progressive Army that is actually being built. Remember this, even if you don't agree with what you heard from me, you only heard this conversation because the Progressive Army is ordinary Americans and volunteers who have decided we're not just going to hate the corporate media, we're going to build our own alternative media. So even if you don't agree with what you've heard from me, at least we're having a conversation that I think is critically important. The last thing that I want to conclude with is this. I think the challenge of our time today is how do we resist the neo-fascism of Trumpism without falling into the neoliberalism of Clintonianism, right? That at the end of the day, we have got to actually build a genuine progressive value system, a culture. We've got to actually do that independently of the control of either the Democratic Party leadership or foundation money or, frankly, big unions or the MSNBC talking heads. It's going to be up to us, ordinary people, working together, and conversations like Brandon and I just had are a critical part of helping to make that happen.
Yeah, I just want to double down on that and echo the sentiments. The most important thing to do is expand these conversations, expand the conversations that are happening at the grassroots, so that they are forced to expand them at the national level, that they're forced to expand them in Congress because people are talking about it to the extent that it can't be hidden by the mainstream media. It can't be hidden by MSNBC. People can't pretend like no one is talking about these things because everyone's talking about them. Insofar that we are at a crossroads right now, I think that one of the things that cannot be allowed to happen is we cannot allow the Democratic Party to position themselves, at least as they stand today, the way they are structured, what their ideology is, what they are doing, as the only legitimate path to defeat Trump, or the only legitimate recourse if you have agreements with Trump. And I think it's very easy to be overwhelmed in these times of, very frankly, it's a quite scary time.
Oh, yeah.
It's very easy to be overwhelmed in these times, but we cannot allow the Democratic Party as it exists today is a snake oil salesman. It is. They are trying to sell you a solution to a problem that they are not qualified to solve, and that problem is Trumpism. And so
our whole frame ought to be: we ain't falling for no banana in the tailpipe. That's actually what
I try not. We are going to end on that because that was perfect. Thank you for joining us for this stunted version of The Way with Anoa. I hope you enjoyed it. My name is Brandon Sutton. Thank you all, and have a good night.
Peace.